So welcome to another one of our artist talks as part of our artist talk series through the MSSU Spider Gallery. And I wanted to introduce Gwen Walstrand. Gwen is a Springfield, Missouri-based artist and professor of photography at Missouri State University. In 2018, Gwen was a recipient of an Arta Laguna Finalist Prize in Venice, Italy, as well as a recipient of a University Award for Distinguished Professors. Gwen has exhibited her photographs in national and international exhibitions, including shows in Spain, Florence, Italy, Philadelphia, and in New York City. Gwen has also received Artist in Residency Awards in Wyoming, Finland, and Regina, Italy. She has published her work, and her work has been accepted into permanent collections at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art and by other private collections in the United States and Italy. So welcome, Gwen.
Thank you for having me. You've done the unmute, okay. Can you hear me in here as well? Thanks, Christine, and everyone here for inviting me to have this exhibition. It has been a real pleasure to put together the work for the show and to visit with you here today. Thanks for coming out in the rain. All right, I'm going to show you some work from or maybe technological difficulties here. It's not responding, nor is the arrow key. Thank you. All right, so work from a previous project, but mostly I'll talk about the current work that is in the gallery. So for about 10 years, I worked on this particular body of work. And the reason I'm showing it to you is because it has a lot to do with landscape, which is also the center of the work that's in the gallery. So with this series of work, I had a very young daughter at the time, and she was somewhat the inspiration and sometimes actively involved in making some of the stick patterns and things like that that I then eventually photographed and put together with other images. So my plan was to kind of connect visual associations between place and experience in a variety of ways. So I didn't really have a particular method. It's not like I had a certain subject that I would go out and photograph. I was just photographing all the time. And then eventually finding out kind of what would fit together, maybe making another piece eventually. So a lot of them use multiple images to kind of build the meaning, and some of them are single images like this one. My inspiration sometimes came from fairy tales or rope skipping rhymes and nursery rhymes, and I particularly like the dark and creepy ones. And there seemed to be a lot of that that could that I could then respond to visually. And so this is one of the nursery rhymes that my grandmother used to tell me. It says, there was a little girl and she had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. And when she was good, she was really, really good. And when she was bad, she was horrid. So the name of this one is Horrid. It goes on for more verses than that. I didn't know that until I was an adult. I only knew this small part of it. But as you can see, the method of making images could be in triptych form, or sometimes it's just a visual association of how they fit together, or content association of what they mean more together. This is Hansel and Gretel, and a lot of these were kind of references to rituals or to not rituals that have specific meaning, but the kind of ritualistic act that helps build tangible connections and meaning in the way that it exists later. So often I was just playing with my daughter, and we were putting rocks on top of leaves on the front porch. And my mother-in-law came over, who was very tidy about everything. And her lawn, she doesn't like to stick down at all. And she says to me, why are you holding down the leaves on your porch with rocks? And I'm like, well, because I'm going to photograph it later. And then meanwhile, the leaves curled up around the rocks and it got better. So these are, meant to be credible, photographic kind of figments, but also fictional, right? Photographs lie better than a lot of other media because we buy into certain aspects of it. But I wanted the handmade qualities along with the fictional and photographic coming together. The work is printed in a process called Van Dyke Brown, and you make a solution, and it's as thin as water, and you coat it on paper like printmaking papers or drawing papers, and it makes it light sensitive. And then the exposure is done out in the sun or with a strong UV light source. So I've used both of those, but the photograph itself is much more like a lithograph or something like that. It does have a bit of a brown color. I was too poor and cheap to spring for palladium or platinum or something else that then I started working in later when I felt more serious about the work, I think. So it's personal, it's very specific to certain events and ideas, but I think it connects to a lot of more universal ideas and experiences about being a parent, about being a child, specifically about being female. And so a lot of those images kind of are loosely grouped around those ideas. This one is called Fates, and it's a rope skipping rhyme. Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief. It should be familiar, right? Have you heard of this before? My kindergarten teacher taught us this on the playground, and she said, wherever you land, that's who you're gonna marry. And even in kindergarten, in the 1970s, I was thinking, but maybe I could be one of those things too, right? So you can see in a lot of these, I'm kind of rearranging things that I find in these places. And the idea of place is very important. There's pens and needles, needles and threads. Walking. So with these, a lot of times the title was important to know because it would lean a little toward intent. And then I started having so much more trouble figuring out how to title anything after that because it was less specific to an event or a place. So this series of work, much of which is in the gallery now, I began sometime between ending the project that I just showed you in about 2008, 2009, and tossing around between projects for too long between that time period and about 2015. And I did a variety of things. I had started a portrait project, which I thought as being completely independent, and it ended up integrating into this project. So in 2015, I started really earnestly photographing in wilderness areas and vast landscapes. And it was related to, I finally figured out, to my interest in the sublime. And the sublime is something in pop culture. We use that word when we mean blissful or serene or calm or something like that, but that's not at all how philosophers and artists have used that term in the past. So in the 18th century, philosophers, including Immanuel Kant and Edmund Burke, wrote about the sublime as an emotional or aesthetic response to that is akin to pleasurable anxiety or beautiful terror. So it's like standing at the edge of the abyss and thinking about falling, but not falling, right? And just kind of seeing the crashing waves and thinking about the power of nature, in this case, the sublime as applied to nature. And so that idea was something I was really interested in. A lot of the painters from that time period were reading the philosophers' work and thinking about this, and they were making paintings that linked the power of nature to the power of God. So the fearful, kind of wrathful ideas were connected to religion or God and nature. And so my interest in the idea of the sublime was much more connected to a more contemporary crisis that we have, the climate crisis that we're in. And so that kind of clicked, and I started thinking about how to make images that would indicate something about that. And that's kind of hard to do because you can't tell somebody else to have a sublime experience or that kind of reaction. It's going to be a little different for a lot of people. But I tried to make some more foreboding, use light and vastness and some of the aesthetic possibilities to think about this very complex idea of the sublime and experiencing beauty, this sort of category of philosophy in a certain way. So I started photographing, and I had some fabulous residencies in Wyoming and in Italy, and it kind of helped along the projects. I got to just spend time photographing and responding to what I had made. The images are printed in Palladium, which is, again, a hand-coated process on cotton paper. And it's much cooler, and it's very, it can change in color and tonality quite a bit depending on humidity. It's a really beautiful, kind of luscious, velvety kind of process compared to traditional black and white papers. So I wanted to try to evoke this idea of the sublime, and I started using just landscape photographs and looking back at this time period between the two projects when I was just making portraits, and I had a completely different motivation for doing that. This was from about 2008. This is a portrait of my daughter. She was my little guinea pig for so many things. So I photographed her as kind of at the start of this proposal, this idea of like, what am I going to do? And I was interested particularly in this age range. She was 10, and this sort of age 9 to 11 or 12 age where the idea of uncertainty is so physically evident in the way that they're built, these half people who are just kind of full of possibility and fragility and vulnerability and so many things that you can see. And then the more self-awareness they gain, the more we try to not show any of those kind of attributes. But I was interested in the idea of uncertainty as a higher state of being. Many scientists, spiritual seekers, so many intellectuals kind of start with the idea of uncertainty, right? Because the outcomes are unknown, the dangers are unknown. When Darwin takes off on the beagle, he doesn't know really what's going to happen. So I was interested in uncertainty as being physically embodied in those children. So I did just portraits for a while. This is what photographers do. They like try to confine their projects very tightly sometimes. And then as I'm working on the landscapes later, and I felt like the portrait project was sort of a limbo, unfinished thing that I might continue, it occurred to me that really to make the landscapes speak the way that I wanted them to, they needed to be adjacent to a lot of the portraits. So I started photographing more children and deliberately trying to link them to the landscape portraits or landscape pictures. Most recently, I got to go to Finland to photograph. That was in 2019. And I got to do a residency there and just hike in a national park and photograph and make prints in a beautiful studio. So interspersing the images of the children with these particular landscapes, sometimes visually they work better together than others. So, you know, I think of it kind of like sequencing images in a book. And using the kind of sense of vastness and dark foreboding images, all these kinds of things together could be potentially by visual association. If you're attentive, you might be able to see what some of that could mean together. So for me, the idea of the sublime was a very perfect idea because it seduces and it scares at once. And I think emotionally and intellectually, sometimes we have to have beauty as a way to connect to images so that we spend a little longer looking. When we look at really challenging artwork, sometimes it's off-putting, but if we're diligent, we'll look at that and we'll begin to understand so much more about it and become to appreciate it. For this work, I really felt like there are enough off-putting things about the content that it would be good if the kind of aesthetic strength of it, beauty, and that sublime connection could be a strong part of that. So the doom and gloom of the landscapes, I hope, are given a glimmer of hope with some of the portraits of the kids. I see them as stand-ins for Greta Thunberg, for, you know, all the activists who are resolved to do something about the climate crisis. And of course, they are potentially the victims as well of our inaction. This is a recent portrait that I made. She was a 5th grader, and she had written to the school district, she and her friend, to try to petition the school to switch over to all electronic or electric buses instead of gasoline school buses. It hasn't gone anywhere yet, but it's good for her. So the climate crisis, I think our planet is warming at a dangerous rate. We don't have a plan. We have many other crises to deal with. It's become really difficult to be more than complacent about it. So I think part of what I want my work to do is kind of call more attention to it. One of the things that I've been working on is potentially working with a poet who I met at one of the residencies in Wyoming. JC Todd and I have been collaborating a little bit, and some of her response to the work in ekphrastic poems is a way that we might both exhibit and publish the work in the future. So most of the images of the children, I'm kind of torn because I've talked with curators, a museum in Kansas who collected some of the work, felt very strongly that I should only photograph girls, that it was, you know, they are all Greta stand-ins, and that a lot of the activists are female. I've gone back and forth on that because that's not all of the activists, but this is one of the portraits from earlier, a couple of brothers, and I think that's still quite strong to include with a lot of these. So I'm trying not to discriminate. I certainly need to photograph a lot more children, and certainly children of color, which I'm still working on. I live in Springfield, Missouri, though. It's kind of tough. So the images are made in Missouri. This is the current river. They're also made in, as I said, in Italy and Finland and Wyoming and various places in Arkansas. The idea of the near and there, part of it's me being bad at coming up with titles, but it's also the idea that, you know, partly of the sublime is that you have this sense of self-preservation at the same time. You're not really hurling yourself over the cliff. You're thinking about it and connected to that idea of danger and power, yet you're watching it from near, this idea of danger from afar. And I feel like that's a lot of the ways that we address the climate crisis too, is that we are very safe when we're watching from afar what is happening elsewhere, and we're not really thinking too much about it, or often enough. So the images are all the same size at the moment, instead of various sizes like the earlier body of work. They are framed about 20 by 24, but the images are closer to 16 by 20 inches. And large enough in some cases to start to become closer to life size, but you know, when you approach them in the gallery. But I've also been thinking of them in book form and making artist books and variations on that. That takes a long time and I can't commit to anything very easily. So I've been working on a lot of those ideas and kind of thinking about different ways of presenting the work. You guys probably get to have a solo exhibition at the end of your studies here, right? And so, you know, all those issues of presentation are things that you begin to think about, not just making the work and turning in a portfolio, but how is it going to be seen? How is this something that is really engages the viewer in the way that you want? So it becomes a lot of different choices to make. And I'm still kind of thinking about the various possibilities and embracing lots of them right now. You guys can shout out questions. Feel free. I have some images about how these things are made as well. Some of you take photography classes here, right? You have some classes. Is it mostly digital, or do you get to do some analog stuff too? Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so these are made with film, but digital capture is one of the ways that this could have happened as well. I just have been kind of committed to working a certain way, and it works for me. Some of them I like seeing this big. I'll have to work on making bigger prints. Trying to end on a little bit of a hopeful note there. That's Zoe. All right, so to show you a little bit about the process that I use, this is a large format camera. I have two different sizes that I use depending on how far I need to haul it. So the one that you see, that's actor Jason Lee, not me, right? And that he's using an 8x10 inch camera there, which means that the negative that he makes with it is 8x10 inches. So it's quite a large piece of information that's gathered, and it folds up fairly small like this, but it's still kind of a big beast to carry around, and always has to be on a tripod. But when you're viewing it and where you're looking very slowly and carefully, there's a lot about the process that is much more thoughtful, of course, than using like the kind of cameras that are in our pockets and, you know, those kinds of things. So when I can, I use the 8x10 when I'm trying to go farther, or I can't really get it in the carry-on. Otherwise, I use a 4x5 camera, like the smaller one here, which is hard to tell scale, but they both kind of fold up into fairly small packages. But the reason that I do it is not for all the optical skewed perspective kinds of things and skewing the plane of sharp focus. It will do so many other things. But I use it for the big negatives so that then I can gather a lot of information and make large prints later. So even though I make negatives that are 8 by 10 inches or 4 by 5 inches, I still typically scan those and put them into a digital format that I then enlarge to a larger negative. So I could make one, I could do this from digital capture. I can make enormous negatives that I could output. But this is kind of the method that I'm using right now because of the way that I work fits it. The Palladium process it can go onto many different surfaces, and you don't really have to have a dark room. You don't need an enlarger or a lot of that equipment. You just need a little bit of dim light. And then you mix up the solution and paint it on the surface very evenly. And then you put it in some kind of contact print frame like this, or just heavy glass on top of it so that it keeps it really flat and in tight contact. During the exposure, it goes from this yellow color to a very dark purpley brown, just depends on the state and the transition. So you could do this under a big UV light source, or this is outside my studio in Wyoming, and that's outside my studio in Finland. Various sizes, depending on how far I had to travel and what all I was carrying. But it makes it very easy and portable to take the process a lot of different places. During the exposure, which is long, if we're in a dark room and we're making an exposure in an enlarger, it's a few seconds to expose that paper. In this process, it might be 30 minutes in bright sunlight. So they're not very sensitive to light. And a slow exposure often will give you better tonal ranges. So here you can see the image is actually forming. Instead of waiting for it to go into a developer step, we see the image starting to form during the process. And so you begin to get good at judging how far along it should be before you take it out and take it through the wet steps. So this is, I got to do a workshop at Eastman House in Rochester, New York. And this is where we're learning to evaluate albumin prints and salt prints. They're very similar. And this is me relearning all the things. I have to take notes and remind myself once in a while, things I've already learned that now I have to learn again. And partly about the process and partly about, just remembering what to pay attention to as an artist and how to keep that part of me engaged. It's difficult being a teacher and an artist, and I didn't even figure out why for so long, is that being an artist means you have to be selfish and you have to carve out time for yourself and your work. And being a teacher is a constant state of giving, resolving problems, helping people out, giving all the information and facilitation that students need to learn. So I think it's especially difficult, maybe more so for women, and we need to slap ourselves and knock it off because we're used to being kind of givers and caretakers in many ways. So to be selfish and to carve out time for your own work, one of the ways that I've done that is through residency programs, where it's like my job while I'm there is just to make my own work. So anyway, reminders to myself, when it works, it really works. And it's nice to see. This is a view outside my studio at UCross in Wyoming, one of the residencies that I did, where 3 creeks come together right outside the studio. And the foothills are in the distance. And beyond that are the Bighorn Mountains. So there's so much to photograph there, so much to see. And for the people who stay in their studio and work all the time, they have this great view of wildlife and creeks. And inside the studio, you can see how I've been able to, just with minimal equipment, adapt the studio for my uses. I just need running water and the ability to make it dark or dim, not even completely dark, just dim. So when I was there, I was able to make large prints like what you see in the gallery. But in other places, I've had to work much more small. International travel doesn't make it easy to bring a lot of stuff along. This is in the Chianti region of Tuscany. It's where they make the great wines and all of that. It's just south of Florence. But I did a shorter residency there for a couple of weeks, and I just photographed and had a show there. But this is the outside view. It was beautiful there, and you could hear people across the valley. The sound carried really well. It was surprisingly noisy, but in a soft way all the time. But people were picking grapes in the season when I was there. And the studio, big shared studio, is a deconsecrated church. So it had been a very tiny country church, and the house that we stayed in had been the rectory. So now, I mean, even though we had a baptismal font and a confessional nearby and a sacristy way back there, which is where we like washed the paints out of brushes or whatever we need to do with running water, we were able to kind of use that space and be inspired by the space too. And we had a show there, and some continuous watchers were peeking over some of the work in the show. More recently, in 2019, I spent the month of June in Koli National Park, which is part of Finland's national park system. And the trails and the light was beautiful. The golden hour that we experience here, and we photographers always talk about photographing it during the golden hour. Well, it's many hours there. It's pretty fabulous. Some of you have traveled to Scandinavian countries before though, right? So you might have experienced what it's like to be in such a place in June. It never really got dark. It got dim between 2 and 4 a.m. So my studio that I was provided, I was the only artist there. At many residency programs, there are multiple artists, writers, composers, sharing, usually private studios, but sharing living quarters. And so you have great dinner conversations, but you also have time to yourself to work. But here, I was alone. My husband was able to come with me, and he would hike with me and carry my tripod, which was a great benefit to have. And then I had this entire studio to myself with running water over in the sort of kitchen corner. And it had these heavy duty shades on the window because it's light too much. And if you want to sleep, they all have these light blocking shades. So it was really great to be able to pull those down and create a dark room and then lift them up and see what's going on in the village below. So the work as it exists, I started showing the landscapes first in about 2016 and not really thinking yet about how to include the portraits or even that I should include the portraits. And then I talked about it for about a year. And then I finally did that based on a lot of good feedback from curators and from other people, other artists I was talking to. And they're like, yes, you need to do that. You keep talking about it and you're not doing it. So I eventually did that. And in this show, you can see there were just a handful of portraits among a lot of the landscapes. So this is, I think, yeah, one of the last images. So I hope I've given you a lot of things to think about, and I think we need to be reminded all the time about the climate. We need to remember, we need to kind of think like Greta. And as she would say, I want you to act like the house is on fire because it is. It seems like such a distant crisis to a lot of us, but most of you are very young and are probably going to have to deal with this at some point. So I think we need to be reminded of it, but we also need to be reminded of the subtlety and the beauty and the possibility and fragility that we all kind of embody and that we could possibly draw upon to help solve this crisis. So I am ready for some questions, and I'm sure you guys have some, right? Well, back in my day, that's what we had. Um, Digital, since it's been around, I have been using digital, and I have another project that's because I wanted to work in color and I wanted to work quickly. I used a small digital camera, so that's on my website, but it's not the main thrust of my work. So I thought I would not try to talk about it here today. But when I was in high school, I started photographing just part of the yearbook staff. And I was interested in it. I had taken a lot of art classes, but I didn't have a lot of instruction or information. The biology teacher at my high school knew how to use a darkroom sort of, and he like spent a day teaching two of us how to do it. And so it sparked my interest. And so when I went to college and I'm considering what I would like to do, I just kind of stupidly fell backward into a really, really good program. So I was lucky because I was just kind of looking at my options, and there was this place, and I had never heard of such a thing, where you could take photography classes inside an art department. I'm like, that's what I want to do. So I fell into a really good program that had really strong faculty, and it allowed me to kind of find out what the possibilities of it were. So I began working with a small camera, 35 millimeter, working very quickly. I loved the street photographer's work, and I kind of turned that on my family for a while, and tried to get out and kind of explore through a small camera. And then after undergraduate school, I went to, I worked for a while, which was convincing me that I really wanted to go back to school too. And I had sort of had that plan and was testing it out, but I think it's good to take a break and to think about testing your own resolve about the work that you can do on your own and learning to be an independent artist. So I worked and I built another portfolio and I applied to graduate school. And my motivation for that was really just that I wanted that intensity of study. I wanted to be able to, we all want to do what we want to do, right? It's like, but I'm like, in undergraduate, you get pulled in a lot of directions and you have to study lots of different things. And it's very important to have that well-rounded liberal arts education. And it's great if you're in a place, as I was, where there's sort of an art school atmosphere inside the liberal arts university system. So, but I wanted to have that intensity. So I went to graduate school for that reason, not really knowing, I knew that that would give me credentials to teach, but I had no idea if I would like to teach. But a few weeks into my first class as a TA, I'm like, yeah, I think I want to do this. So I pursued it eventually, but that was kind of like all those years, the 1980s and 90s, I was working in analog because that's what we had. And it seemed like a very quick medium. And now my students, they think it's so painful to use the darkroom and to have to wait and not immediately see the results of their, shutter release. So it's a different way of thinking and working. And I think in our program, a lot of they have choices now, digital or analog, for their first photography class. But I think for majors, it's really important for students to start with analog because they understand so much more about it, but they also kind of create a discipline that is it serves them well in a lot of other aspects of that. So yeah, now we can have many more things to learn and teach. But one of the things I like about the process that I'm using is that I have the best of all those worlds going on, the hybrid approach of digital materials and manipulation of those materials. But the artifact that I end up with is something that is much more satisfying to me than ink on paper, which can be, I mean, there's some beautiful inkjet papers out there that give wonderful results, but for me, it's the object that I want out of it in the end. Other questions? I gave her a very long answer. Started back in high school. That's a good question. I think it's really critical, and one of the reasons that I like pull out the equipment and make a picture any place I stop is because the way the light looks at that particular moment. And I think I hope that it does something to communicate more about the ideas of the sublime and you know, this sort of foreboding doom-filled kind of idea at the same time that it's got the much more beautiful way of rendering some of those ideas. So, but light is really critical. And of course, it's what photography is built of altogether. But I think that kind of dramatic light that I'm always seeking, and the kind of light that you get in a forested situation with little shafts of light coming in. It happens in a city as well, that kind of canyon thing that can happen with multiple light sources bouncing off of one another. But there's something about that that I think links us to the importance or significance of a place. There's a sense of almost spiritual, but not necessarily religious, but kind of a connection to place that I'm always seeking. And I think the years between projects, as I call it, part of that was me trying to think about how to communicate place and the significance of place through light, through all the visual tools that I had. And so that part of it was really critical and did help me kind of, once I had this idea of the sublime, really think about a purpose. Suddenly it's like, now I know what I'm doing and what I want to do with it. But there was a lot of just like, oh, the light is lovely and it has this kind of significance and spiritual quality to it that connects us to place, maybe. And, you know, so there were a lot of thoughts like that, but I didn't have a real clear direction in some of those years. And of course, you know, I don't get to full time it very often. So it slows down the process of thinking about it, I think, more than it does actually making the work. I can run downstairs and develop a batch of film pretty quickly, but giving the time to kind of think about the work and the ideas that hopefully will evolve with the project, that takes some time. Other questions? You've been such a nice audience. And those of you on Zoom, I'm sure you are too. Of course, we have a little time in the gallery if you guys want to ask me questions you don't want to shout out here. I will be around for a little while and I'll be happy to answer questions there too. Okay.
So we do have a viewing reception to follow from 1 to 2 p.m. And again, Gwen will be here if you have questions for her or you want to ask her anything specific to a particular work of art. But thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.